this video, we're going to talk about how to project a baseline value for player points in NBA daily fantasy sports. And this is going to be part of a video series where I'm going to be teaching you step by step how to build your own daily fantasy sports model. We're going to start off very, very basic, and this is intended for if you've never built a daily fantasy sports model before, even if you've never used Excel before. You should be able to follow along with this, and hopefully it should help you kind of be able to build a model based off factors that you think are important in NBA daily fantasy sports. So you can see I have my sheet here. I formatted it differently than what your sheet will look like, but I want you guys to go ahead and if you're working along, we're going to label 6 columns right off the bat. So these columns are going to be player name, player historical minutes, historical fantasy points per game. Then we're going to calculate points per minute from those two. Then obviously our baseline fantasy points projection. That should actually be the last column. And then we also have projected minutes. So I'll go ahead and switch those two. But there you go. So those are going to be our 6 columns. Again, this is a very, very basic projection, but it should start to give you a sense of how we do some of the things here and how to build your own model. Next, I'm going to talk you guys through the 4 worksheets I have here in my workbook. So obviously this one is where we're going to be projecting our player points. Next, I have projected minutes. And eventually you might be able to project your own minutes, but there are a number of sites that offer them. You can see that the projected minutes I have here are actually the ones taken directly from our daily newsletter. And in a daily newsletter that we provide every day, there is a downloadable data sheet which has projected minutes, projected ownership, obviously our value for projected points, but it also has a ton of advanced matchup statistics, which when we do get into more advanced adjustments that we want to make to our projected points, will be incredibly helpful. So the nice thing about that too is that that data sheet is already in an Excel format, so you can just copy and paste it right into your workbook. Next, I have our lineup for today, and I'm going to be using FanDuel for this video tutorial series, and that's because FanDuel locks players to a single position, whereas DraftKings allows players to fill multiple positions, and that can get very confusing farther down the road. So if you're building your first model, and you play both FanDuel and DraftKings, I definitely recommend starting off with FanDuel. If you just play DraftKings and you want to stick to that, that's okay too. There are some workarounds you can use, which I'll talk through, but it's definitely going to be a bit more advanced. And then finally, my last sheet is historical player data. So I believe I got this from Basketball Reference, and we're not affiliated with them in any way, but they are a great site, tons of basketball statistics formatted really nicely in tables. And what we're going to obviously be using here is the minutes played per game statistic. And then again, just talking about this one more time, the way that you can get this is just by logging into your FanDuel or DraftKings account online. So I got this one onto FanDuel.com. Then you click on the contest that you're interested in, and there's a little button that says download player list. Or it might say on DraftKings export to CSV. And then click that and it takes you right to an Excel sheet which you can copy and paste into your workbook. Okay, so let's get started with projecting player points. The first thing we need to do is obviously get our player names into the sheet. And the way we're going to do that is we're just going to hit equals, go over to our today's lineup, and then click on the player name, the first one, and hit enter. Next, you're going to highlight that, drag down. I recommend going to around row 400 because there's typically never going to be more than 400 players on an NBA slate. And then you're going to hit Control D. Obviously, some of these are going to fill with zeros because we have less than 400 players today. But you should see that the rest of our players have filled in nicely. Next, we're going to want to get player historical minutes. So remember, that's going to be in the historical player data sheet under minutes played. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to right click here and hide the rest of the columns so we can just see those right next to each other. What you're going to do here is you're going to go equals. We're going to use a function in Excel called XLOOKUP. So once you've typed that in, you're going to first need your lookup value. And our lookup value is obviously the player name. Now we're going to need our lookup array. So where are we going to be looking for our player name in? And that's going to be the series of player names here. And you can drag this all the way down if you want. I'll do it the first time. And then hit comma, and we're going to need to get our return array. And remember, our return array is the minutes played. So essentially what we're doing here is we're looking for Steph Curry's name in all these names, and we're saying, once we find that, return the value in this column. Return his minutes played. And this time, instead of dragging down, I'm going to show you guys a shortcut. You can just go in here, and you can see that previously when I dragged down, it was from B2 to B480. Now I want to make sure these numbers match up, so I want my array to be from H2 to H480. Close the parentheses, and you're going to hit enter. You can see there, Steph Curry's minutes have populated the minutes column nicely. What you're going to do now is you're going to go into each of the little areas of the array, so exactly what I just did with my cursor, and we're going to need to lock these arrays. And if I don't do that when I paste my formula down, the array is also going to move, and this can cause us to miss certain players. So what you're going to do is you're going to go in here and you're going to hit Fn F4. If you have a Mac, all you have to do is hit F4. I have a window, so I'm hitting Fn F4, and you can see that it locks these cells with a $sign. And that's probably the most confusing thing you're going to have to do in this tutorial. But once you figure that out and do it a couple of times, it's actually pretty straightforward. So take a look at that. Remember, we're using our lookup value, player name, lookup array, the whole set of names, return array, the set of minutes played. Enter. Now that we've locked that, we can drag it down all the way to row 400 and hit Control D. And obviously there's some error cells here because there's no player name with the name of 0. But that's not going to be an issue because we don't really care about these values anyways. What I'm going to do next is I'm getting a bit annoyed that I have to drag it down every single time. So I'm just going to put in a couple ones here to fill that out. And you can see that there's certain players, and I'll talk about this later, whose names are different on FanDuel than they are on Basketball Reference. And we can fix this by creating a naming standard, and that might actually be the next video I make. But for now, we're just going to ignore that problem and get into our fantasy points per game. Again, we're going to use, so actually for fantasy points per game, we luckily don't even need to use an XLOOKUP function because the player names, which we imported from the FanDuel sheet, are going to be in the exact same order as where we're finding the fantasy points per game. So I don't know if I explained that clearly, but obviously we took all of these from the FanDuel sheet, we just dragged them down, so we can do the exact same thing with fantasy points per game here. So you're going to go equals today's lineup, fantasy points per game, enter. And I'm going to get rid of some of the decimals there. And now that I put the 1 at the bottom of the sheet, I can just go Control Shift down, and then Control D, and there you go. Our fantasy points per game have populated the sheet. Now what we need to find is the player's historical points per minute. What we want here is how many fantasy points per minute has Steph Curry been averaging this season? And this is important because let's say we know Curry's going to play 40 minutes tonight, or we think Curry's going to play 40 minutes tonight. In order to get to our baseline projection for his points, we also need to know how many points per minute he's been playing on the season. So to do this, we're going to go equals fantasy points per game divided by minutes. And you can see here Steph Curry on the season is averaging 1.36 FanDuel fantasy points per minute. I'm going to get rid of some of the decimals again, this little button up here. And then Control Shift down, Control D. And you can move back up to the sheet with Control Shift up, back up in the sheet. And next we need the projected minutes. Because like I said, to get our baseline projection for points, all we're going to do is multiply projected minutes by points per minute. And so this time we are going to use our XLOOKUP function again. So we're going to go XLOOKUP Steph Curry. Our lookup array is the set of player names. And this time I'm not going to drag all the way down. I'm just going to put in 400. Because I know that if I go to row 400, that's going to be enough to encompass all the player names I have here. Comma, return array, 400, close parentheses, and hit enter. And then again, remember, I need to go in and I need to go Fn, F4 to lock these arrays. You can go to the top, Control Shift down, Control D, Control Shift up to get back to the top of the sheet. And now we're almost done creating our baseline projection for player points. All we have to do is we have to multiply our player points per minute times our projected minutes for tonight. And you can see that as a baseline, without knowing anything about Curry's matchup, we would project him for 47.46 points tonight. And actually at Analytics City, we'll sometimes look at fantasy players' points per minute over the last 15 days or the last 5 games. But for a guy like Curry, that's not necessarily going to be too different from his seasonal points per minute. It might be more relevant for a guy who's recently stepped into a bigger role on the offense. So that's probably why we would do that. Again, if you wanted to do that, you would just have to find minutes over the last 15 days, which I'm sure is available on a number of websites. I'm not going to shout any others out because, as I said, we're not affiliated with them. But you can find last 15 days player stats and use the minutes for that as opposed to seasonal minutes if you wanted to get fantasy points per minute over the last 15 days instead. And then obviously you would also need not the seasonal fantasy points, you would need the fantasy points over the last 15 days. But yeah, that should wrap up this video on how to create baseline projections for player points. I'm just going to paste these down. And the next kind of steps are where it will really get more interesting. Because obviously these are not going to be the final projections we're going to use. There might be a case where Steph Curry, who I think we have right now as one of the best, or one of the highest projections of any player tonight, could be in a really great matchup. In which case we would probably adjust his projected points upwards. And I think he is playing the Brooklyn Nets tonight, so that's a case where the Brooklyn Nets have been allowing a ton of points tonight. I don't think they've been defending the three particularly well. I don't think they've been defending point guards particularly well. So if you look at our newsletter tonight, you can probably expect to see Curry's projection higher than 47.46. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video and you want me to continue this series, leave a comment, leave kind of some feedback on what you guys would want to see next. I think what I'm going to talk about is how to create that naming standard so you can avoid these issues where player names that are spelled out differently on two different sites return error values. and then I kind of would start touching on how to adjust player points based on the factors that you think are important using the matchup statistics that we can provide in our daily data sheet, or matchup statistics that you can find from doing other research online. So thanks, and I'll see you guys in the next one.